Hello and welcome to our next video on the classical period. We are going to be looking at chapter 7, which is on the classical symphony. We'll also be looking at chapter 8, which is on the concerto, and as well as chapter 9, which is on classical chamber music. Chapters 10, 11, and 12, which cover the three main composers of the classical period, will be covered next week. So let's start off with the classical symphony, and as usual, we'll be using our study guide to guide us along in the conversation. For those of you that may have stumbled across this video on my YouTube channel, you don't necessarily have to have this. This is for a music appreciation course. They do have access to this through my Blackboard, but you can just follow along if you're just here just to learn a little bit more about classical music. Again, the classical period is from 1750 to 1820. Some people extend that to around 1830s, and some people actually refer to the early part of the classical period as the Rococo period. So sometimes you will see the true classical period referred to at around 1770s. But for the purpose of our class, we're a general music appreciation class. We're going to sum all that up and round it off from about 1750 to 1820. All right, so let's look at what the symphony is. It asks you here, how many movements do each of the following forms usually have? And the symphony is the one that we're going to talk about first. The answer to that question is 4. There are 4 movements in the typical classical symphony. Now, the symphony we're going to learn is a form that was fully realized in the classical period. It was widely used. It helped standardize the orchestra, and symphonies are still composed to this day. They are still used by composers. However, modern day symphonies, as well as symphonies composed during the Romantic period, which follows the classical, may exhibit different characteristics, such as the 4 movement thing. For instance, if you're looking at an American composer who writes a symphony in the 20th century, it may not have 4 movements, or it may have 4 movements, but there's no actual breaks between them or something like that. However, in the classical period, it pretty much was standardized at 4 movements. Sometimes composers didn't complete symphonies. Schubert, his famous unfinished symphony, Symphony Number 8, and the reason we call it unfinished, and that's because he never finished it before he died. However, that's in the next period, so don't worry about that one just yet. But do realize that the standard form during this period, the classical period, is 4 movements. And if you recall from our last study guide, we talked about what the typical 4 movement structure was in the classical period. We can even go and pull that study guide up and look at that section. I just want to remind you of it real quickly. It was near the bottom of the first page here. If you recall, the first movement's usually fast, second movement's usually slow, third movement's usually dance related or medium tempoed, and the fourth movement is usually fast as well, sometimes faster than the first. So fast, slow, medium, fast is the overall tempo of that. However, composers didn't just call these movements by their tempo. For instance, a composer might say allegro, which means fast in Italian, but then add con brio, which means with spirit. So the tempo marking is not always what they would indicate. Sometimes when you look at these movements and you look at their titles, it can tell you more than just the speed. It can actually tell you, for instance, the spirit or mood, overall mood of it. However, do keep in mind that classical works often do have contrast of mood within a single piece. So just because the mood is called allegro con brio doesn't mean, that both of the themes included in that movement may necessarily exhibit that. Okay. Concerto. Concerto, it is pronounced concerto. Don't say it, concerto. I know it's real tempting to just pronounce the concert in that, but it's pronounced concerto. And you should already know this because you may recall from the Baroque period we had a form called the Concerto Grosso. And the Concerto Grosso did eventually inspire the classical concerto. However, there are a few differences. However, they do have one thing similar. They both have three movements. If you recall, the typical Baroque concerto grosso has three movements. Guess how many movements the classical concerto has? That's right, three. And in the case that you don't have this fourth movement, you basically just eliminate this third movement. You have the first movement fast, second movement slow, and then your third movement is also fast. And keep in mind that sonata form that we talked about in our last video, that can be used for the first and last movements. It can sometimes even be used for a third movement, although the third movement choice, if you recall from last week, was the minuet and trio, or sometimes the scherzo. Second movement could be really anything. You could even use sonata allegro form, or you could use something like theme and variation, but it usually is your slow, sweet, lyrical one. Second movement also is usually the one that's not in the home key of the piece. You probably are going to notice that most symphonies are called by their number, the number in which they were composed, as well as what key they're in. And like we talked about last week, you may not be a good enough musician to be able to hear exactly what key it's in. Most people can't do that, but your mind does realize the tonal center of these pieces, and it does have a psychological effect anytime you change key or something like this. Even in pop music, when the song changes key, it does have an emotional and psychological impact. So the second movement, that's kind of what also helps set it aside from the rest of it. It usually is a one that's in a different key. All right, so back to our study guide. We wrap up with the string quartet. We're going to learn that string quartets are basically miniature symphonies. They have a quartet of string instruments. Now, most students think that that is a violin, a viola, a cello, and a double bass because there's four different members of the violin instruments in the string section. But we're going to see whether or not that's true or not here in a minute because we have a question here about it. But the number of movements in it, since it is like a miniature symphony, it shares the same number of movements, and that's four. And it has the same basic four movement structure that you find in most symphonies. Okay, so what is a cadenza? A cadenza is best explained in the video section if you go on this, and I'll try to like I said last week, get these videos here. I've already put the rondo on my channel, so you can check out the video on that. But in this video here, the classical concerto, and then I also have a video on the symphony. We're gonna try to get those available on the channel. If you are on Blackboard, you can definitely access those on my old channel. There's links to them there. But the classical concerto, I encourage you to check out this video and watch it to answer that question, because that question is best answered not by me telling you, and I can tell you. You can go to the chapter on the concerto and you can read what a cadenza is and you can see what it is, but it really helps to hear it and see it put into place. Just note that the cadenza that Horowitz, the pianist, plays in this Mozart concerto that I use as an example, it actually is a pre-written cadenza. And I believe it's the one that Beethoven wrote for this Mozart piano concerto. So most cadenzas, that's one note that I would like to make, is that a lot of times cadenzas were not written out like that. Even when you listen to it, it doesn't really sound like it's written out. It sounds like he's kind of improvising on the spot. So basically, if you want to know just a textbook definition of a cadenza, there it is. It's an unaccompanied section of virtuoso display for the soloist in a concerto. One of the things that distinguishes the classical concerto from the Baroque concerto grosso is that in concerto grosso, you would have a small group of soloists. However, by the time you get to the classical period, they started focusing on a single instrument. And if they ever do include other instruments, they will let you know in the title. They will call it something other than just a concerto. So if you hear the title of the piece is Piano Concerto, the piano is the only soloist in the piece, and therefore the pianist would be the only one that would play the cadenza. Sometimes you do have what are called double concertos, which have two soloists, but we're going to focus on just the standard one soloist classical concerto. And generally speaking, if you just hear the word concerto, that generally is speaking about the classical concerto, as we have gotten in the habit of trying to identify concerto grosso by calling it concerto grosso. But even then, you need to know your research. You need to do your research sometimes. For instance, Bach wrote Brandenburg concertos, and those are just called concerto, but those are concerto grossos. So sometimes it really helps to know. That's one of the reasons we want you to know the composer and which period he lived in. Bach, being a Baroque composer, would not have been alive long enough to write a classical concerto. So, knowing which period a composer lived in really helps in that respect. All right, so for that question, read in chapter 8 what a cadenza is, and then, like I said, look up the video on the classical concerto, which will probably be included in required viewing for this week. All right, so moving right along. Number 3, what instruments are in a string quartet? Well, I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you to guess, and before I reveal the answer, think of which 4 instruments you probably think make up the string quartet. Obviously, there are 4 because we say quartet. We don't say duet, trio, quintet, sextet, or none of that stuff. We say quartet. And just like a barbershop quartet has 4 singers in it, so a string quartet has 4 string instruments. But which 4 string instruments are there? Are they? If you said there's 1 violin, 1 viola, 1 cello, and 1 bass, then you're incorrect. That is a common mistake I see on the upcoming quiz that you have on this section. A lot of students assume that's what it is. But it's actually 2 violins, 1 viola, and a cello. And you can see that on the rondo video on my channel. It's posted on my old channel as well as this YouTube channel. If you just search for videos on the YouTube channel, you'll see one that says what is a rondo, and you will see that is using a string quartet, and you will actually see the string quartet. Plus, your textbook talks about the string quartet in chapter 9, which deals with chamber music. Chamber music is music for a small group. It's designed for a chamber or room instead of the big concert hall. And the string quartet was probably the most widely used one of the classical period. And there you go, 2 violins, viola, and cello. Now, sometimes you will hear people refer to quintets or trios or something like that, and there's not always a standardization to that because sometimes it can be a little confusing when you say it's a quintet, because sometimes that can mean, like, for instance, 4 string instruments and a clarinet or something like that. So you got to be a little careful sometimes with those. But if it says string quartet, you can almost always expect these instruments right here. And all of our major composers that we're going to look at next week, they all wrote string quartets, and they are still being written. As a matter of fact, I had some friends that got married when I was in graduate school at North Carolina School of the Arts, and one of their favorite pop songs, um, I actually I knew that they had a string quartet playing for their wedding. They had already told me that they were hiring one, and they had asked me to pick out some music for the string quartet to play. Well, as part of a wedding gift, I arranged their favorite pop song, one that they actually planned to dance to at the reception, and I actually took that song and arranged it for string quartet. So people are still using string quartets today, not just in weddings, but in the concert hall and stuff like that. So it's still a popular choice to be used to this day. Keep jumping around to the wrong windows here. Okay, moving on to the next one. What is the definition of chamber music? Well, I think I already defined that one, but just to make sure, chamber music is music for a small group. The word chamber is a fancy word for a room. So once you start getting enough musicians where the room is going to get a little crowded, and again, keep in mind that the aristocracy was still hiring some of these people, so a room might refer to a ballroom or a saloon or something like that. And then I think I meant salon not saloon. I think a saloon in a saloon, a bar in the middle of the Old West or something. Salon would be like a gathering place. So the room could be fairly large. You might recall in Amadeus when Salieri first met Mozart, he was playing that piece of music for woodwinds, and it was where Salieri saw them giggling on the floor and joking around and stuff like that. That big room that they were playing it in, that still is a small enough ensemble that would have classified as chamber music. But once you start having a fairly large orchestra or opera or something like that, that's stage music. That's art music intended to be performed in a concert hall. So even though you might still play some of the chamber music in concert halls today, many of them were not originally intended for that. So if you go see a string quartet nowadays, you may see them up on the concert stage, on a big giant stage, and we may listen to it that way. But sometimes string quartets were composed for small evening gatherings and things like that, and the music was kind of more atmospheric. It wasn't necessarily concert music. Other times they did write string quartets, and they were meant to be intently listened to. All right, so moving on, know the nationality of these composers. That kind of deals again with next week's material because that deals with the three main classical composers we'll look at. So we're going to skip over that one for the time being, as well as this next one to ask you questions about Haydn and Mozart and stuff like that. Um, Now, dealing with the actual chapters, I'm going to back them up and I'm just going to provide some additional commentary. The stuff that we just went over is the most essential stuff that you need to know for your next quiz. However, please note what it says right here. There are going to be 5 listening questions on the next quiz, and these will cover the concerto, the symphony, the rondo, the minuet and trio, and sonata. Now, we already covered sonata form last week, but I didn't really cover that much what a sonata was. So I want to take a real quick opportunity to talk about what a sonata is and how it differs from sonata form. You may recall that last week when we talked about sonata form, it talked about a single movement form. And again, I have this diagram here that you can check out and see what the form is like. This explains the form in detail. It's found in the study guide section. This is for a single movement. And notice that we use the word form or we say sonata allegro form. Those are the 2 different names we have for it. If you hear a piece of music simply called sonata, for instance, Beethoven wrote a piece of music called the Moonlight Sonata. Now, he didn't call it Moonlight Sonata. Some people later on added the name Moonlight, but notice that it's just called sonata. That refers to a 3-movement composition, usually for a solo instrument. The only time it's not for a solo instrument is when the solo instrument can't play the harmony. So you could write a sonata for any instrument that can play both melody and harmony, and it just be one instrument. For instance, piano sonatas, like the Moonlight Sonata. However, if you're going to write a sonata for, say, a clarinet, the clarinet can play only the melody. It can't play the accompanying harmony at the same time. So oftentimes, in that case, you will see an instrument that can play harmony accompany the instrument. But that main instrument's still the focus. So in a clarinet sonata, you would see just the clarinet and then, say, for instance, a piano accompanying it. So if you see the word sonata form, that is, or sonata allegro form, that is for a single movement composition. And by the way, this chart that I'm using here, this is also found in your study guide section. This is called the Classical Period Listening Study Guide. And this is to help prepare you for the 5 listening questions. All 5 examples of the listening questions are listed here for you. And you will notice that there is a section down here that says the sonata is a multi-movement work that's not covered so much in your text other than it is mentioned in the same chapter, chapter 3, as sonata form. But it's mentioned so briefly and doesn't really get, you don't have any examples in your listening and stuff like that. That it kind of gets plowed over a little quickly. So I want to take just a minute because some of the most beloved works from the classical period are sonatas. There's a piece of piano music, a piano sonata that Mozart wrote called Rondo alla Turca. Rondo alla Turca. If you type that out and you do a search for it, like say on Google, we're going to type it. It's Rondo alla Turca, and that's how you spell it. Turca. And if you play this piece of music, you'll probably recognize at least the first movement, at least. And then, of course, like I said, there's the Moonlight Sonata that is very famous by Beethoven. As a matter of fact, look up Alicia Keys' songs, or the Piano and I. Songs in A minor is the name of the album that this song is from, but there's a song called Piano and I by Alicia Keys. Look that up and you'll recognize that she uses the Moonlight Sonata in the beginning of it. So there's some very famous examples of sonatas that come from the classical period. Now keep in mind that the classical sonata is different than the way Baroque composers use the word sonata. Baroque composers basically use the word sonata for as a catch-all term. A sonata could be anything just about in the Baroque period. But in the classical period, it kind of comes down to a three-movement composition for solo instrument, sometimes accompanied by piano. All right, so that does it for that particular one. Let's see. I want to make sure. Sorry, I'm jumping around here. But you will notice that you do have 5 listening, and this guide here will give you examples. Now, CDs are listed because basically this guide here is a few years old. This is back when we actually had a CD set that came with it. But I also have listed the names of the compositions, and most of those are still used in your Learn Smart as well as in your Learn Smart is a smart book, but you will find most of these not in the chapters that we covered tonight, not in chapters 7, 8, or 9 or stuff like that. Matter of fact, some of the chapters do have examples, like the chapter on Rondo, but the ones that we cover tonight, 7, 8, and 9, notice there's no listening examples there. This does not mean that you don't have any examples of these in your book, because you do. So if you're having trouble finding those, actually go to the chapters on your composers. Look at chapter 10, and you will notice that you have a concerto there. It's a trumpet concerto. And one note about that trumpet concerto, by the way, I do not like the fact that your textbook uses this as your piece for Haydn. Granted, this is a very popular piece of music. Many trumpet players that I went to school with, if they were trumpet majors, this was one of the first pieces they played at their recital. I mean, this is a pretty standard piece of trumpet music, but the fact of the matter is, Haydn wrote this basically for a prototype trumpet that had valves. Nowadays, yeah, we got valve trumpets all over the place, but don't think listening to this that there were a lot of trumpet concertos composed in that day, because brass instruments were fairly limited. Now, Mozart did write a few horn concertos that are very famous, but brass players just that could play melodic material back then without the valves, they were pretty hard to come across. However, if you look at your section on Mozart, you will see. Now, I'm not going to quiz you on classical opera, but next week we will address how, when we talk about Mozart, we will address how operas changed some in the classical period. So you do have a few opera examples from Mozart. And then, of course, with Beethoven, you can't talk about Beethoven without talking about symphonies. His symphonies are probably the most famous in the world, specifically his Fifth Symphony that starts off with this very famous, probably the most 4 famous notes in all of classical music. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum. I mean, you can practically just go bum, 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 sing those first 4 notes, and almost everybody can respond with the following 4 notes. I mean, who hasn't heard this? This is quite common. And his Ninth Symphony has the the Ode to Joy final movement that everybody kind of knows. And if you're not familiar with that one, we'll probably take a quick listen to it next week. So really, there's no excuse though. You shouldn't never find yourself struggling to understand what these things sound like, because not only do I provide you with some videos in the video section here, Click on the classical period to find those. I have study guides for you. And also, you can go on YouTube and just look up a plethora of examples for each of these. Just make sure that you're looking up, the classical composers. Well, make sure you're looking up Beethoven, Mozart, and Haydn, because if you're looking up like Debussy or something like that, then that's going to be the wrong period. Um, and so there's plenty of examples out there that you can look up, and generally speaking, you want to look for examples that have like a live orchestra. That way you don't get like a hip hop remix of Rondo alla Turca or something like that. But surely you would be able to figure out that that wasn't, what it sounded like in Mozart's day. All right, okay, so real quick, in summary, check out this listening guide. This will give you the major characteristics to listen to. You will have 5 questions at the beginning of your next quiz. And you will be able to listen to those as many times as you need to. The quiz is timed, so you won't be able to take forever looking them up, but you should be able to hear certain excerpts. And some of these you will need to listen to them for like 2 to 5 minutes to be able to distinguish which form it is. For instance, on a rondo, you really kind of have to listen to that kind of repeating pattern in it. And so you may have to, it'd be hard pressed for you to identify a rondo in the first like 20 seconds because its very nature, it has that recurring A theme that keeps coming back. So most of these, though, if you study on this and you look for these basic characteristics here, all of this will get you adequately prepared for your next quiz. All right. That pretty much does it. I know this is a bit of a shorter video than we've been having. We've usually been having lectures go somewhere around an hour, but that you still have plenty of side stuff to do. You've got your reading to do. You've got this study guide. You've got that study guide. So I don't want to bog you down with too much time spending on lecture. I feel like I've addressed the basic points of these. And if you do want to know a little more than what I've covered, then check these sections out in your textbook. There's also further research you can do online. Again, this is a music appreciation general course. It's not designed to go as in depth as, say, a music major would take or nothing like that. So we're going to try to stick to the basic stuff that you would encounter just as a basic audience member if you ever attend classical music concerts or want to listen to them through recordings or something. You'll have a better idea what you're listening to. So as usual, contact me with any questions, concerns, or whatnot. Check out the videos again, like I said, especially on the Concerto and the Symphony, and do utilize all of these various handouts. Oh, I almost forgot. This one here has actually been posted for some time on Blackboard, but it can be found in the study guide section. Some of you might have stumbled across it. It's called The Orchestra Throughout the Ages, and this shows you the history of the orchestra, starting in the Baroque period. You see how small and modest the Baroque period orchestra was, and this shows you what the classical orchestra looked like. Why is this important? Because it'll help you identify the sound of a classical symphony. This is what the instruments that make up that would usually play symphonic works. And this would include big choral works that have symphonies, that have orchestras accompany them, like Mozart's Requiem would have been accompanied by this. So notice we have percussion finally. Yay, timpani. Timpani did start appearing in the late Baroque, but they were pretty standard by the time you got to the classical period, especially since the Turkish Janissary bands, that often went through the streets of Vienna. That's where that helped make these instruments more popular. And sometimes you will even see crash cymbals used a little bit, but timpani are pretty standard. We do occasionally see some brass, but remember they don't have valves, so they don't do much other than just offer little punches to the harmony. And then it's mainly the woodwinds that are used for contrast against the dominating string section. So we had that as a question, by the way, in last week's study guide, which was which section of the orchestra still plays most of the music in symphonic works, and that's the string section or the string family. So utilize all these various guides that I have for you and study up on it, and you should be well prepared for your next quiz. Like I said, email me with any questions.